For years, he stood among ordinary people, a quiet U.S. Navy sailor, calm, unnoticed, and completely invisible. Yet across cities and oceans, a hidden pattern was forming in silence, one that no one connected, no one questioned, until the fragments finally aligned, revealing a man who had mastered the art of blending in so perfectly that the truth remained hidden in plain sight. Chapter 1: The Quiet Beginnings of a Hidden Life. There are some stories that begin with noise, with chaos, with warning signs that seem obvious in hindsight. And then there are others, far more unsettling, that begin in silence. Stories that unfold so quietly, so invisibly, that by the time anyone notices, the truth has already been buried beneath years of ordinary life. This is one of those stories that if you had walked past him on an ordinary day, you would not have stopped. You would not have looked twice. There was nothing about John Eric Armstrong that demanded attention. No striking presence, no unsettling stare, no outward sign of darkness. He existed in that vast middle ground of humanity, the kind of person who blends into the background of everyday life without resistance. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing about him, because some individuals do not stand out. They disappear into normalcy. They become part of the fabric of routine. The neighbor you nod to, the quiet coworker, the man standing in line behind you at a grocery store. Familiar, but never truly known. John Eric Armstrong was, by all outward appearances, just that kind of man. But the reality beneath that surface was far more complicated. To understand how someone becomes invisible in such a profound way, you have to begin long before anything alarming ever happens. You have to step back into the earliest moments of a life that, at first glance, seemed unremarkable. A childhood that did not immediately signal what it would eventually become. Because the truth is, there is rarely a single moment where everything changes. It is usually a slow process. A gradual shaping. Small, almost imperceptible influences that begin to layer over one another, quietly building something that no one else can see. John Eric Armstrong was born into a world that, on the surface, looked stable. There were no headlines announcing tragedy, no immediate indicators that something was deeply wrong. His early life did not come with the kind of dramatic beginnings often associated with notorious figures. And yet, there were elements, subtle, easily overlooked, that would later take on a different meaning. In many cases, what defines a person is not just what happens to them, but how they interpret it. Two individuals can experience similar circumstances and emerge entirely differently. One adapts, finds resilience, and moves forward. The other internalizes, reshapes reality in quieter ways, and carries those experiences into something more complex. Armstrong's early years were marked by an environment that, while not outwardly extraordinary, carried its own quiet tensions. These were not always visible to outsiders. In fact, to most people, everything likely appeared normal. But normal is often a matter of perspective. Inside a home, within the private space where no one else is watching, dynamics can unfold that never make it beyond those walls. Emotions can go unspoken. Confusion can linger without explanation. And a child, trying to make sense of the world, begins to form interpretations that may not align with reality, but feel real nonetheless. This is where the story truly begins, not with actions, but with perception. As a child, Armstrong learned early on how to navigate his environment in a way that kept attention away from him. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He was not the one seeking recognition. Instead, he adapted by observing, by staying quiet, by becoming someone who could exist without drawing scrutiny. But it's a skill that, in many ways, can be seen as harmless, even useful. But over time, it can also become something else entirely. Because when someone learns how to go unnoticed, they also learn how to hide. And hiding, when practiced long enough, can become second nature. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a person can build an entire identity around appearing ordinary, not because they are ordinary, but because they understand what ordinary is supposed to look like, and they replicate it. For Armstrong, this ability to blend in would become one of the defining aspects of his life. It allowed him to move through different environments without raising suspicion, to interact with others in ways that seemed entirely normal, to construct a version of himself that others accepted without question. But beneath that surface, there were thoughts, impulses, and patterns forming, quietly, gradually, and without interruption, and no one around him could see them. This is often the most difficult part to understand when looking back at cases like this. The absence of obvious warning signs, the lack of a clear turning point, the fact that, for years, nothing appeared out of place. That it challenges the idea that danger is always visible, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it is hidden behind routine, behind politeness, behind the small, everyday interactions that never seem significant at the time. Armstrong grew up learning how to maintain that illusion that he understood, even at a young age, how to present himself in ways that met expectations, how to respond appropriately, how to exist within the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior. And in doing so, he created distance, not physical distance, but psychological distance, that a separation between who he appeared to be and what he was becoming internally. This kind of separation doesn't happen overnight. It develops slowly, reinforced over time by repetition. Each moment of blending in, each instance of avoiding attention, each small success in remaining unnoticed, until eventually it becomes automatic. And when something becomes automatic, it no longer requires effort. It simply is. As the years passed, this pattern continued to solidify. Armstrong moved through different stages of life without drawing concern. To those around him, he was simply another individual navigating the same world as everyone else. There were no immediate reasons to question him and no clear indicators that anything was wrong. But that is precisely what makes this story so compelling and so unsettling. Because while nothing appeared wrong on the outside, something was already taking shape beneath the surface, something that would remain hidden for years, something that would continue to grow quietly, without interruption, and something that, when it finally emerged, would force people to reconsider everything they thought they understood about what it means to truly know someone. For now, though, none of that was visible at this stage. The story remains calm, almost uneventful, the kind of beginning that feels distant from anything alarming. And yet, it is here, in this quiet, unremarkable start, that the foundation is laid. A foundation built not on chaos, but on silence. A silence that would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. Silence has a way of shaping a person in ways that are difficult to detect from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. Instead, it settles in quietly, becoming part of the background, influencing thoughts and behaviors in subtle but lasting ways. As John Eric Armstrong moved further into adolescence, the patterns established in his early years did not disappear. They deepened. By this stage of life, most individuals begin to form clearer identities. Friendships become more defined. Emotions become more complex. There is a growing awareness of how one fits into the world, and, perhaps more importantly, how one is perceived by others. For Armstrong, perception remained central. He had already learned how to exist without drawing attention, and this ability continued to guide him. He was not someone who stood out in social settings. He did not command a room. Instead, he remained on the edges, present, but not prominent. And in many ways, that invisibility became a kind of shield, because when no one is watching closely, fewer questions are asked. During these formative years, internal experiences often become more vivid. Thoughts become more structured. Emotions, whether understood or not, begin to influence behavior in stronger ways. For some, this leads to self-expression, creativity, or connection. For others, it leads inward. That Armstrong's world increasingly became one that was shaped internally rather than externally. While others were navigating friendships and social dynamics, he was developing a private understanding of himself, one that was not necessarily shared with those around him. This is not uncommon. Many people experience a gap between their inner thoughts and their outward behavior. But in most cases, that gap is balanced by connection, by conversations, relationships, and experiences that bring those internal thoughts into the open. In Armstrong's case, that bridge appeared to remain limited. And when thoughts remain unshared, they can evolve without challenge. They are not questioned, not corrected, not tested against reality. They simply grow. There is something important to understand here, not as an excuse, but as a piece of the larger picture. Human behavior is often shaped by reinforcement. When certain patterns go unnoticed, they are more likely to continue. When there is no interruption, no external feedback, those patterns can become more deeply ingrained. For Armstrong, the absence of interruption was significant. He continued to move through life without raising concern. Teachers, peers, acquaintances, no one seemed to view him as unusual in any alarming way. If anything, he was likely seen as quiet, perhaps reserved, but otherwise unremarkable. And that word, unremarkable, is key because it implies a lack of attention, a lack of scrutiny. And in this case, a lack of awareness. As he transitioned into adulthood, Armstrong carried these patterns with him. The ability to blend in, to maintain a composed exterior, to navigate different environments without drawing notice. It all remained intact. But adulthood introduces new layers of complexity. Responsibilities increase. Independence grows. Opportunities expand. And with that expansion comes the possibility for change. For many, this is a time of growth, exploration, and self-discovery. People move, take on new roles, form new relationships, and begin to define their place in the world. Armstrong did all of these things, but he did them in a way that continued to preserve his ability to remain unseen. One of the most defining choices he made was joining the military. Specifically, he entered the United States Navy, a decision that would significantly shape the trajectory of his life. At first glance, this path might seem like a structured and even stabilizing environment. The military provides routine, discipline, and a clear sense of purpose. It places individuals within a system that values order and accountability, but it also offers something else: mobility, movement across different locations, exposure to new environments, the ability to exist in multiple places over time without long-term scrutiny from any single community. For someone who has learned how to blend in, this can be a powerful combination. Armstrong's time in the Navy allowed him to travel extensively. He visited different countries, experienced different cultures, and lived a life that, to many, might have seemed adventurous or even admirable. And once again, he maintained his outward normalcy to his fellow sailors. He was simply another member of the crew, someone fulfilling his duties, participating in the shared routines of military life. There were no widespread reports of alarming behavior, no immediate red flags that would suggest something deeper was unfolding. But as always, the absence of visible signs does not mean the absence of underlying activity, because while his external life appeared structured, his internal world continued to evolve. And this is where the contrast becomes most striking. On one hand, you have a man functioning within a disciplined, organized environment, following rules, completing tasks, meeting expectations. On the other hand, you have a private inner life, one that no one else can see. A life where thoughts are not shared, where impulses are not questioned, where patterns continue to develop without interruption. The ability to maintain these two realities simultaneously is what makes cases like this so difficult to comprehend. It challenges the assumption that behavior is always consistent across contexts, that who someone is in one environment reflects who they are in all others. But human beings are more complex than that. They are capable of compartmentalization, of separating different aspects of their lives in ways that prevent overlap. And Armstrong appeared to do this with remarkable consistency. As the years passed, this dual existence became more refined. He understood how to navigate expectations, how to respond in ways that aligned with what others anticipated, how to present himself as someone who fit within the system. And because of that, he continued to avoid suspicion. It's important to pause here and consider what this means. For a significant period of time, Armstrong lived a life that, from the outside, appeared entirely ordinary. He worked, interacted, traveled, and existed within structured environments without raising concern. There were no dramatic incidents that forced people to take a closer look, no moments that disrupted the illusion. And so, the illusion remained intact. But illusions, no matter how well maintained, are still just that. They are not reality. They are carefully constructed versions of reality, designed to be seen, accepted, and believed, and behind them, the truth waits, unseen, unquestioned, and growing. By the end of this chapter, nothing outwardly alarming has yet occurred. There is no clear turning point, no moment where everything changes. And that, perhaps, is what makes this stage of the story so important, because it reminds us that the most significant developments are not always the most visible ones. Sometimes they happen quietly, over time in the absence of attention, and by the time they finally come to light, they have already been years in the making. Chapter 2. A childhood shaped by silence and shadows. Childhood is often described as a foundation, a time when the earliest impressions of the world begin to take shape. It is during these years that a person starts to understand safety, trust, connection, and identity. But what happens when those impressions are unclear or quietly distorted? The answer is rarely immediate. It doesn't arrive all at once, like a sudden storm. Instead, it unfolds gradually, shaping perception in ways that may not even be recognized until much later, if they are recognized at all. For John Eric Armstrong, childhood was not defined by a single catastrophic event that could easily explain everything that followed. There was no singular moment that stood out as a clear turning point. Instead, it was something more subtle, more complex, and far more difficult to trace. It was a childhood marked by quiet instability. From the outside, his early life did not necessarily appear unusual. Families often carry tensions that are invisible to those beyond the household. Arguments, emotional distance, unspoken struggles, these are not uncommon. And because they are so common, they are often overlooked. But for a child, these experiences are not background noise. They are formative. They become part of the lens through which the world is understood. Armstrong grew up in an environment where consistency may not have always been present. Stability, in its truest sense, not just physical, but emotional, can be difficult to define when it is absent. And when a child does not have a clear sense of that stability, they begin to adapt in ways that allow them to navigate uncertainty. Sometimes that means becoming more expressive, seeking attention, trying to regain a sense of control, and sometimes it means becoming quieter, observant, careful. This quiet adaptation can be easily mistaken for calmness or maturity. A child who does not cause trouble, who does not demand attention, who seems to exist peacefully within their environment. These are often seen as positive traits. But silence can carry many meanings. That it can be a sign of contentment, or it can be a sign of withdrawal. And distinguishing between the two is not always easy. In Armstrong's case, the silence appeared to lean inward. Rather than expressing confusion or distress outwardly, he seemed to internalize it. Experiences were processed privately, without external validation or correction. This kind of internal processing can lead to a unique challenge because when thoughts and emotions are not shared, they are not shaped by outside perspectives. They are left to develop on their own, influenced only by the individual's interpretation of events. And interpretation, especially in childhood, is not always accurate. At a moment that might seem small or insignificant to an adult can feel much larger to a child. An interaction that is quickly forgotten by one person can linger in the mind of another, reshaped and revisited over time. Without guidance or clarification, these interpretations can take on a life of their own. They become beliefs, and beliefs, once formed, can be difficult to change. There are accounts and discussions surrounding Armstrong's early life that suggest he experienced moments of vulnerability, situations where he may have felt powerless or unable to fully understand what was happening around him. These moments, whether clearly remembered or not, can leave an imprint, not always as a clear memory, but as a feeling, a sense of confusion, a lack of control. And over time, that sense can influence how a person interacts with the world. One of the most important aspects of childhood development is the formation of boundaries, understanding where one person ends and another begins, learning what is acceptable, what is not, and how to navigate relationships in a way that respects both self and others. When those boundaries are unclear or inconsistently reinforced, it can create a lasting ambiguity and uncertainty about control, about agency, about identity. For Armstrong, this ambiguity may have played a role in shaping how he viewed interactions and relationships, not in an obvious or immediately visible way, but in subtle, underlying patterns that would continue to develop over time. Another key element during childhood is the need for connection. Not just physical presence, but emotional availability. The feeling of being understood, of being seen. When that connection is limited or inconsistent, a child may begin to rely more heavily on their internal world. Thoughts become companions. Imagination becomes a space of escape or control. And while imagination is a natural and often positive aspect of development, it can also become a place where reality is reshaped, where scenarios are created, where outcomes can be controlled in ways that real life does not allow. Over time, this internal world can grow more complex, more detailed, and more separate from external reality. For someone like Armstrong, who already demonstrated a tendency toward quiet observation and internal processing, this separation may have become more pronounced. He was learning, not consciously, but gradually, that control could exist internally, even if it was not always present externally. And that realization, while subtle, can be powerful, because control is a fundamental human need. When it is lacking, people find ways to recreate it, sometimes through achievement, sometimes through relationships, and sometimes through more private means. As Armstrong moved through his childhood years, these patterns continued to take shape. There were no dramatic disruptions that forced a reevaluation of his behavior. No external interventions that brought his internal world into focus. Instead, everything continued as it had, quietly, unnoticed, unquestioned. This is where the concept of hiding in plain sight truly begins to take form, not in actions, but in development, because the ability to remain unseen is not something that appears suddenly in adulthood. It is learned, practiced, refined over time. And in Armstrong's case, it began here in a childhood that, to most observers, seemed ordinary, but beneath that ordinary surface, something more complex was unfolding, something that would continue to grow, layer by layer, shaped not by dramatic events, but by subtle experiences, internal interpretations, and the quiet absence of intervention. And as with all such developments, it did not announce itself. It simply continued. There is a quiet complexity to childhood that is often only understood in retrospect. At the time, moments pass quickly. Days blend together. Experiences that feel significant in the present are rarely labeled as such. They simply become part of life, absorbed, processed, and stored somewhere beneath conscious awareness. For John Eric Armstrong, these moments did not disappear. They accumulated, and like layers of sediment settling at the bottom of a still body of water, they began to form something deeper, something that would not be immediately visible, but would remain present beneath the surface. As he continued to grow, the patterns of observation and internalization became more refined. He was learning not only how to exist quietly, but how to interpret the behavior of others with increasing precision. This ability to read situations, without necessarily engaging in them, can create a unique kind of awareness, an awareness that is detached. It allows a person to see interactions from a distance, to analyze them without becoming fully involved. And while this can sometimes lead to insight, it can also lead to disconnection, because observation is not the same as participation, and over time, that difference begins to matter. In Armstrong's case, there are indications that he became increasingly comfortable in that observational role. He was present in his environment, but not fully immersed in it. He understood the expectations placed upon him, and he met them, but without necessarily forming deeper connections. This kind of detachment is not always obvious to others. It can look like calmness, like independence, like someone who simply prefers solitude. And in many cases, that is exactly what it is. But in other cases, it reflects something more complex, a gradual distancing from emotional engagement, a preference for internal processing over shared experience, and a growing separation between what is felt and what is expressed. One of the challenges with this kind of development is that it rarely triggers concern. There are no disruptions, no outward conflicts that demand attention. Everything appears stable, and so everything continues. As Armstrong entered his teenage years, the world around him expanded. Social structures became more defined. Expectations increased. There was a greater emphasis on identity, on understanding who you are and how you relate to others. For many, this is a time of exploration. But for someone who has already developed a strong internal world, it can also be a time of reinforcement, because instead of seeking external validation, the individual may rely even more heavily on their internal framework, their own interpretations, their own logic, their own sense of understanding, and without external input to challenge or reshape those perspectives, they can become more rigid, more fixed. This is where the concept of control begins to take on a new dimension. Not control in an obvious or outward sense, but control over perception, over how one is seen, over how one navigates different environments without revealing too much. Armstrong had already learned how to blend in. Now, he was learning how to maintain that blend with greater precision. He understood what was expected of him, and he delivered it. He knew how to respond in ways that aligned with social norms. He knew how to avoid drawing attention to himself, and because of that, He continued to move through life without raising concern. But beneath that surface, the internal world he had been building since childhood was becoming more complex, more structured, more defined. There is something important to recognize here. Internal development does not stop simply because it is not visible. In fact, in some cases, it accelerates. When thoughts are not shared, they are not limited by external perspectives. They are free to evolve in ways that may not align with reality, but feel entirely logical to the person experiencing them. And over time, those thoughts can begin to influence behavior. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually in subtle ways. This is how patterns begin, not as clear, identifiable actions, but as shifts in thinking, in perception, in how one relates to the world. For Armstrong, these shifts were not obvious to those around him. He continued to fulfill expectations, to exist within the structures of daily life without disruption. But internally, something was changing. The sense of detachment that had begun in childhood was deepening. The separation between his internal experiences and his outward behavior was becoming more pronounced. And with that separation came a certain kind of freedom, a freedom to think without consequence, imagine without limitation, explore ideas that were never spoken aloud. This is not, in itself, unusual. Many people have rich internal worlds. Many people think things they never say. But what matters is how those thoughts are managed, whether they are challenged, whether they are balanced by external reality, or whether they are allowed to grow unchecked. In Armstrong's case, there is little evidence to suggest that his internal world was meaningfully challenged during these formative years. There were no significant interventions, no moments that forced him to confront or reevaluate his thoughts. And so, they continued quietly, steadily, uninterrupted as he approached adulthood. These patterns had become deeply ingrained. The quiet child had become a quiet young adult. The observer had become someone who could navigate complex environments without revealing his inner world. And perhaps most importantly, the separation between appearance and reality had become a defining feature of his identity to others. He was still unremarkable, still ordinary, still someone who did not demand attention. But that ordinariness was not a reflection of simplicity. It was a construction, a carefully maintained exterior that concealed something far more complex beneath it. By the end of this chapter, there is still no outward indication of what is to come, no clear sign that anything is wrong. And that is precisely what makes this stage so important, because it highlights a truth that is often difficult to accept, that the absence of visible problems does not always mean the absence of deeper ones. Sometimes, the most significant developments happen in silence, in the spaces where no one is looking, in the moments that pass without notice. And by the time those developments become visible, they have already taken root. Chapter 3. Learning to blend in. The mask of normalcy. By the time John Eric Armstrong stepped fully into adulthood, the foundation of his personality had already been carefully shaped, layer by layer, quietly reinforced over years of observation, restraint, and internalization. What made him stand out was precisely the fact that he did not stand out at all, and in many ways, that was his greatest strength. Because the world does not often question what appears ordinary. It trusts routine. It accepts familiarity. It assumes that what looks normal is normal. Armstrong understood this, not as a conscious strategy at first, but as something he had gradually learned through experience. The ability to blend in had become second nature. It was no longer something he actively thought about. It was simply how he existed. He knew how to speak when necessary, and how to remain silent when it was not. He understood the rhythms of social interaction, the expected responses, the subtle cues that guided everyday communication. He could mirror behavior, adapt his tone, and present himself in ways that made others comfortable. And when people are comfortable, they stop looking deeper. This is how a mask is formed, not a physical disguise, but a behavioral one, a carefully maintained version of oneself that aligns with expectations, that avoids suspicion, that exists within the boundaries of what others perceive as safe and predictable. For Armstrong, this mask was not something he put on occasionally. It was constant. It followed him into every environment, into conversations, into workplaces, into relationships. It allowed him to move through different spaces without friction, without drawing attention to anything that might have seemed unusual. And over time, the line between the mask and the person wearing it began to blur. This is one of the more unsettling aspects of human psychology. When a behavior is repeated often enough, it becomes integrated. What begins as an adaptation can evolve into identity. The distinction between what is real and what is performed becomes less clear, not only to others, but sometimes even to the individual themselves. Armstrong was, by all outward accounts, functioning normally. He held responsibilities. He followed routines. He interacted with others in ways that did not raise concern. There were no obvious disruptions, no dramatic incidents that would suggest anything out of place. But normalcy, in this case, was not an absence of complexity. It was a concealment of it. As he continued his time in the United States Navy, this ability to maintain a composed exterior became even more refined. The military environment, with its structure and discipline, provided a framework that he could operate within effectively. There were clear expectations, defined roles, predictable routines, and for someone skilled in blending in, this kind of environment can be both stabilizing and enabling. Stabilizing, because it offers order; enabling, because it reduces the likelihood of scrutiny, as long as expectations are met. Armstrong met those expectations. He performed his duties. He followed instructions. He existed within the system in a way that did not disrupt its function. To those around him, he was simply another sailor, another individual contributing to the collective routine. There is something important to recognize here. The ability to function within structured environments does not necessarily reflect internal alignment with those structures. It reflects the ability to adapt to them. And adaptation, especially when it becomes habitual, can mask a wide range of internal experiences. Armstrong's life during this period was, on the surface, consistent. He moved from one location to another, experienced different cultures, and engaged in the day-to-day responsibilities of military service. But beneath that consistency, there remained a separation, a divide between his external behavior and his internal world. This divide is not always visible in obvious ways. It does not necessarily manifest as conflict or disruption. Instead, it exists quietly, influencing thoughts and perceptions without altering outward behavior. And because it does not disrupt, it is rarely questioned. As Armstrong traveled, he encountered different environments, each with its own norms, its own expectations, its own social dynamics. And in each of these environments, he demonstrated the same ability to adapt, to blend, to remain unnoticed. This consistency is what made him so difficult to identify later on, because there was no single version of him that stood out. He was, in every setting, what the setting required him to be. And that adaptability created a kind of invisibility, not because he was physically hidden, but because he was psychologically aligned with expectations in a way that prevented deeper examination. People tend to notice what deviates from the norm. They pay attention to what stands out. But when someone fits seamlessly into their surroundings, there is little reason to look closer. Armstrong understood this, whether consciously or not, and he used it, again not necessarily as a deliberate strategy at first, but as a continuation of patterns he had developed since childhood. Patterns of observation, of restraint, of controlled interaction. But as time passed, something began to shift, not in a way that was immediately visible, not in a way that disrupted his external life, but internally. The complexity that had been building for years was reaching a point where it could no longer remain entirely passive. Thoughts that had once been abstract began to take on more structure, more definition, more presence. And while these changes were not visible to those around him, they marked an important transition. Because this is often how significant developments begin, not with action, but with thought, with a shift in how one perceives the world, in how one interprets experiences, in how one relates to others. For Armstrong, this shift did not alter his outward behavior. At least not yet. He continued to fulfill his roles, meet expectations, maintain the mask of normalcy that had become such a defining part of his identity. But beneath that mask, something was evolving. Something that would eventually move beyond thought, beyond internal experience, into something far more tangible. And by the time that happened, the mask would still be in place, unchanged, unquestioned, and just as effective as it had always been. There is a quiet precision to living behind a mask that most people never have to think about. For many, identity is fluid but authentic, a natural extension of thoughts, emotions, and experiences. But for someone who has learned to carefully construct how they are perceived, identity becomes something else entirely. It becomes performance, not in a theatrical sense, but in a controlled, deliberate alignment with expectations. A way of existing that prioritizes how one appears over what one truly feels. By this stage in John Eric Armstrong's life, that performance had become seamless, that he no longer needed to consciously adjust himself in every interaction. The responses came automatically. The tone, the posture, the behavior, it all flowed in a way that felt natural to others. And that was the key. Because when something feels natural, it is rarely questioned. Armstrong had mastered this balance. He knew how to exist within conversations without revealing too much, how to participate just enough to maintain normalcy, but not enough to invite deeper scrutiny. He was present, but never overly engaged, approachable, but not memorable. And in that space, between presence and invisibility, he found consistency, but consistency, when paired with internal separation, can create a kind of quiet tension, not the kind that explodes outward, but the kind that builds slowly beneath the surface. A tension between the external self that is constantly maintained and the internal self that remains unexpressed. Over time, that tension demands resolution. And when it is not addressed in healthy or constructive ways, it begins to shape behavior in more subtle, indirect forms. For Armstrong, the internal world he had been cultivating for years was no longer static. It was becoming more active, more defined, more influential in how he experienced the world. This did not immediately disrupt his external life. He continued to function within the structure of the Navy. He followed routines, interacted with others, and fulfilled his responsibilities. To those around him, nothing had changed, but internally, the balance was shifting. The separation between who he appeared to be and what he was experiencing began to widen. And with that widening came a sense of duality. Two parallel existences. One that was visible, structured, and predictable, and one that was private, unobserved, and increasingly complex. This duality is often difficult to detect because it does not always produce outward conflict. In fact, it can exist quite comfortably alongside normal behavior for a time. But as the internal world grows more dominant, it begins to influence perception, how situations are interpreted, how interactions are understood, how others are viewed. And this is where the shift becomes significant, because perception shapes action, even if that action is not immediate. Even if it remains internal at first, that Armstrong's experiences during his time at sea exposed him to a wide range of environments. Different cultures, different social norms, different levels of anonymity. In many ways, this broadened his external world, but it also provided something else: distance. Distance from any one community that might have noticed subtle changes over time. Distance from consistent observation. Distance from long-term relationships that might have offered insight into his internal state. This kind of mobility can be liberating, but it can also be isolating, because without consistent connections, there are fewer opportunities for reflection. Fewer moments where someone might notice a change, ask a question, or challenge a behavior. And in that absence, patterns are allowed to continue uninterrupted. The Armstrong's ability to adapt to different environments only strengthened his mask. He could adjust quickly, align with expectations, and maintain the same outward normalcy regardless of where he was. But beneath that adaptability, the internal patterns he had developed were becoming more fixed, more ingrained. There is something important to understand about patterns that are reinforced over time. They become easier to follow, more automatic, less questioned, and eventually, they begin to feel like the only way to exist. For Armstrong, the internal and external divide had reached a point where it was no longer just a separation. It was a system, a way of organizing his experiences, a way of navigating the world. And within that system, the mask remained intact, unbroken, unchallenged. But systems, like all things, are not static. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they reach a point where they can no longer contain what has been building within them. This is where the story begins to shift. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in a way that signals the beginning of something new. Because while Armstrong continued to function outwardly as he always had, there were subtle changes taking place beneath the surface. Changes in thought patterns, in perception, in the way he related to the world around him. These changes were not visible to others. They did not disrupt his routine. They did not alter the mask he had so carefully maintained. But they were there, and they were growing. This is often the most difficult stage to recognize in hindsight, because there are no clear markers, no definitive moments that stand out. Only a gradual shift that, at the time, goes entirely unnoticed. And yet, it is this stage that often determines what comes next, because once internal patterns reach a certain level of intensity, they begin to seek expression, not necessarily in obvious ways, not immediately, but inevitably. For Armstrong, that point was approaching. The mask was still in place. The routine was still intact. The illusion of normalcy remained unbroken, but beneath it, something had changed, something that would not remain hidden forever. And when it finally surfaced, it would challenge everything that had come before it. Because the most unsettling truths are not the ones that arrive suddenly. They are the ones that have been present all along, waiting to be seen. Chapter 4. The first cracks beneath the surface. There is a moment in many stories, not always visible at the time, not always recognized even in hindsight, when something begins to shift. It is not a dramatic break or a sudden collapse, but rather a subtle fracture. A quiet deviation from what once felt stable. For John Eric Armstrong, that moment did not arrive as a single event. It emerged gradually, like a faint line forming beneath a polished surface, almost invisible at first, but slowly extending, deepening, becoming something that could no longer be contained indefinitely. Up until this point, Armstrong had maintained a remarkable level of control over his outward life. He had learned how to meet expectations, how to exist within structured environments, how to interact without revealing the complexity of his inner world. But control, when sustained over long periods without release or reflection, can begin to strain. And when that strain builds, it seeks an outlet, not always in obvious ways, not immediately, but in forms that reflect the internal landscape that has been developing over time. A.S. Armstrong continued his service in the Navy. The environments he moved through became more varied. Each new location presented different dynamics, different levels of anonymity, different social norms, different opportunities for interaction. And with that variation came something else, opportunity, not in the sense of conscious planning, but in the sense of possibility. The possibility to act outside of the patterns that had previously defined his behavior. The possibility to explore impulses that had, until now, remained contained within his internal world. This is often how the first cracks appear, not as deliberate choices, but as moments where the boundary between thought and action becomes less rigid. For years, Armstrong had lived with a clear separation between what he experienced internally and how he behaved externally. That separation had been consistent, reliable, and effective, but now it was beginning to shift. The thoughts that had once remained abstract were becoming more tangible, more immediate, more difficult to ignore. And with that change came a new kind of tension. A tension between maintaining the mask and responding to what lay beneath it. First, these shifts were subtle. They did not disrupt his daily routine. They did not draw attention. To anyone observing from the outside, Armstrong continued to function as he always had. But internally, the balance was changing. The internal world that had once been contained was beginning to press outward. And this is where the concept of control becomes more complex. Because control is not just about maintaining order. It is also about managing impulses, about deciding what is acted upon and what remains unexpressed. For Armstrong, that balance had been stable for years, but now it was becoming more difficult to sustain. There is something important to understand about moments like this. They are not always recognized as significant when they occur. They do not come with clear labels or warnings. They feel like small shifts, minor deviations, but over time, those small shifts can lead to larger changes. And once those changes begin, they can be difficult to reverse. Armstrong's environment played a role in this transition. The mobility of military life meant that he was not anchored to a single place. There was no consistent community observing him over long periods. No stable set of relationships that might notice subtle behavioral changes. Instead, there was movement, constant change, new faces, new surroundings, new contexts. And within that constant movement, there was a kind of freedom. A freedom from continuity. A freedom from long-term scrutiny. And that freedom created space. Space where boundaries could be tested, where internal impulses could be explored in ways that might not have been possible in a more stable environment. At this stage, it is important to remain grounded in what is known. There were no immediate, widely recognized incidents that marked this period as dramatically different from what came before. No public moments that signaled a clear turning point. But that does not mean nothing was happening, because much of what defines a person's trajectory occurs beneath the surface, in thought patterns, in perception, in the gradual shifting of internal boundaries. For Armstrong, these internal shifts were becoming more pronounced. The detachment that had characterized his earlier years was now accompanied by a growing sense of engagement, though not in a way that connected him more deeply to others. Instead, it was a different kind of engagement, an inward focus that began to influence how he viewed the world around him. And as that perspective changed, so too did the way he navigated his environment, not in ways that were immediately visible, but in ways that would, over time, lead to something more concrete. This is often the most difficult part of stories like this. The realization that there is no clear moment where everything changes to no single event that explains the transition from one state to another. Instead, there is a process, a gradual evolution, a series of small, often unnoticed shifts that accumulate over time. And by the time those shifts result in something visible, they have already been in motion for far longer than anyone realized. Armstrong was still, outwardly, the same person he had always been: quiet, unassuming, ordinary. But beneath that exterior, the first cracks had begun to form. And once a crack appears, no matter how small, it changes the structure. It introduces instability. It creates the potential for something more. At this point, that potential had not yet fully manifested. The mask was still in place. The routine was still intact. The illusion of normalcy remained unbroken. But the foundation beneath it was no longer as solid as it once seemed. And that change, though invisible, was significant, because it marked the beginning of a transition. Point one that would continue to develop. Point one that would eventually move beyond thought, beyond subtle shifts, into something that could no longer be hidden. There is a quiet threshold that exists between thought and action. Most people encounter it every day, often without realizing it. A fleeting idea, a passing impulse, something that arises and then fades without consequence. It is part of being human, to think things that are never acted upon, to experience moments that pass without leaving a mark. But sometimes, that threshold begins to change, not suddenly, not in a way that announces itself, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. The distance between thinking and doing begins to narrow. What once felt abstract starts to feel closer, more tangible. The line that once separated imagination from reality becomes less defined. For John Eric Armstrong, this shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, shaped by years of internalization, detachment, and the absence of external interruption. By the time he reached this stage, the patterns that had formed throughout his childhood and early adulthood were deeply embedded. He was still functioning outwardly in the same way, meeting expectations, maintaining routine, blending seamlessly into his surroundings. Nothing about his external life suggested a loss of control, but internally, something was changing. The thoughts that had once remained distant were becoming more immediate, more present. They were no longer just part of a private inner world. They were beginning to influence how he experienced reality. And with that shift came a new kind of awareness, an awareness of possibility. Not necessarily in a conscious, fully articulated way, but as a subtle recognition that the boundaries he had always maintained were not fixed, that they could be crossed. This is often how significant behavioral changes begin, not with a clear decision, but with a gradual redefinition of what feels possible. At first, these changes are small. They exist in moments, brief, almost unnoticeable deviations from routine thinking. But each time that boundary is approached, it becomes slightly easier to approach again. And over time, the unfamiliar becomes familiar. The unthinkable becomes conceivable. For Armstrong, this process was unfolding beneath a surface that remained calm and controlled. To those around him, there was no visible indication that anything had shifted. He continued to interact as expected, to fulfill his responsibilities, to exist within the same patterns that had defined his life up to this point. But the internal experience was no longer the same. There was a growing sense of tension, not chaotic or overwhelming, but persistent. A quiet pressure that did not resolve on its own. And when tension is not released or addressed, it seeks an outlet. Sometimes that outlet is constructive, sometimes it is neutral, and sometimes it moves in a direction that is far more concerning. At this stage, Armstrong's environment continued to play a role in shaping what was possible. The mobility of his life meant that there were few consistent observers, few people who knew him well enough, over a long enough period of time, to notice subtle changes in behavior or demeanor. This lack of continuity created a kind of isolation, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a relational one that he was surrounded by people, but not deeply known by them. And when a person is not deeply known, there are fewer opportunities for intervention, fewer chances for someone to notice that something has shifted, fewer moments where a question might be asked. And so, the process continues uninterrupted. Armstrong's ability to maintain his outward composure became even more significant during this time. The mask he had developed was not only intact, it was effective. It allowed him to navigate his environment without drawing attention, even as his internal experience became more complex. This is what makes cases like this so difficult to understand from the outside. The coexistence of two realities: a visible life that appears stable, predictable, and entirely ordinary, and an internal world that is evolving in ways that are completely hidden. These two realities do not always conflict, at least not immediately. They can exist side by side for extended periods of time. But eventually, the internal world begins to influence the external one, even if only in small ways at first. Subtle changes in behavior, in perception, in decision-making. And once those changes begin, they tend to build upon themselves. Because each action, no matter how small, reinforces a pattern, and patterns, once established, become easier to follow. This point in Armstrong's life, those patterns were beginning to take shape, not in ways that were visible to others, not in ways that disrupted his routine, but in ways that were significant nonetheless. The internal had begun to move toward the external, and that movement, though still in its early stages, marked a turning point. Because once the boundary between thought and action begins to shift, it rarely returns to its original state on its own. It requires interruption, awareness, intervention, and in the absence of those things, it continues, quietly, steadily, until it becomes something more. By the end of this chapter, nothing has yet surfaced in a way that demands attention. The changes remain internal, the mask remains intact, and the illusion of normalcy continues without disruption. But beneath that illusion, the structure has changed. The first cracks have formed. The boundaries have shifted, and the distance between who Armstrong appears to be and what is developing beneath the surface has grown wider than ever before. It is a stage defined not by action, but by transition. A moment where everything still looks the same, but nothing is quite as it was. And as with all such transitions, it carries a quiet inevitability. Because once something begins to change beneath the surface, it does not simply return to what it was. It continues. Chapter 5: Double Life at Sea. A Sailor's Secret World. There is something uniquely disorienting about life at sea. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, dissolving the sense of place that anchors most people to reality. Days blend together beneath the rhythm of waves and machinery. Time becomes fluid. Locations change, but the environment remains strangely constant. Isolated, contained, and distant from the familiar structures of everyday life. For many, this environment brings clarity, a sense of discipline, a focus sharpened by routine and responsibility. But for others, it creates distance, a separation from the world they once knew. And in that separation, something else can take root. By the time John Eric Armstrong had settled into his role within the United States Navy, he had already mastered the art of blending in. He understood how to exist within structured systems, how to meet expectations without drawing attention, how to maintain a presence that felt entirely ordinary. And the Navy, in many ways, was the perfect environment for that. It provided routine, hierarchy, clear expectations, but it also provided something less visible: mobility without permanence. Ships moved, crews rotated, locations changed, and with each change came a reset. A new environment where past impressions did not necessarily follow. A place where identity could remain consistent on the surface, even as internal experiences evolved beneath it. Armstrong adapted to this life with the same quiet precision that had defined him for years. He performed his duties, followed commands, maintained the expected demeanor of a sailor to those around him. He was simply part of the system, reliable, present, and unremarkable. But the very nature of life at sea introduced a unique psychological landscape: isolation, even when surrounded by others, long stretches of repetition, moments of stillness interrupted by bursts of activity, and perhaps most significantly, a sense of detachment from the outside world. For someone already inclined toward internalization, this environment could amplify existing patterns, because when external input is limited, the internal world becomes more prominent. Thoughts become louder, more persistent, more influential. Armstrong's internal landscape, which had been developing quietly for years, now had space to expand. To evolve without interruption. And while his external life remained structured and controlled, the internal tension that had begun to build in earlier chapters did not disappear. It intensified. There is something important about environments that lack continuity. When a person moves frequently, they are not observed over long periods by the same individuals. Patterns that might become noticeable in a stable setting can remain undetected when there is constant change. Each new location offers a kind of anonymity, a fresh context, a reset of perception. And Armstrong moved through these environments with ease. He understood how to align himself with expectations quickly, how to integrate into new groups without standing out, how to maintain the same consistent outward identity, regardless of where he was. But beneath that consistency, the duality that had been forming within him became more pronounced. Two parallel existences: the structured life of a sailor, visible, disciplined, predictable, and the internal world, private, evolving, and increasingly complex. This duality did not create immediate conflict. In fact, it functioned smoothly. Because the two sides did not yet interfere with one another, the mask remained intact, the routine remained uninterrupted, and so the illusion of normalcy continued. But illusions, by their nature, require maintenance. They depend on consistency, on the absence of disruption. And as Armstrong's internal world grew more active, maintaining that balance required more effort. Though not in ways that were visible to others, it was a quiet effort, a mental one, a constant alignment between what was experienced internally and what was expressed externally. And over time, that alignment becomes more difficult to sustain, because the more complex the internal world becomes, the harder it is to contain it entirely. There is also something about travel, about moving through different cultures and environments, that can influence perception. New places bring new perspectives, different social norms, different levels of anonymity. And for someone who is already detached, these changes can create a sense of separation from any fixed reality, a feeling that life is fluid, that boundaries are not as rigid as they once seemed. For Armstrong, this fluidity may have reinforced the shifts that had already begun within him. The idea that identity could remain constant on the surface, while the internal experience changed beneath it. That one could exist in multiple realities simultaneously. And as this understanding deepened, so too did the sense of possibility. Again, not necessarily as a conscious realization, but as an underlying awareness that a recognition that the structures he operated within did not fully define him, that there was space beyond them. And within that space, the internal patterns that had been developing for years continued to evolve to this stage. It is important to emphasize that nothing outwardly dramatic had yet occurred. There were no visible breaks in behavior, no incidents that disrupted the image he had maintained to everyone around him. Armstrong was still the same person, calm, quiet, ordinary, but internally, the distance between who he appeared to be and what he was becoming was growing. And that distance, while invisible, was significant because it created a gap, a space where something new could emerge, something that had not yet taken form, but was no longer entirely contained. Life at sea continued. Days passed. Locations changed. The routine remained. But beneath that routine, the quiet evolution of Armstrong's internal world continued without interruption. And with each passing moment, the balance between control and expression became more delicate, more uncertain, more difficult to maintain indefinitely. Because no matter how strong a mask may be, it is still a mask, and beneath it, the truth remains, waiting. The longer a person lives within two separate realities, the more natural that separation begins to feel. What might once have required effort, maintaining a clear boundary between internal thoughts and external behavior, gradually becomes automatic. The mind adapts. It organizes itself in a way that allows both realities to exist without immediate conflict. For John Eric Armstrong, this adaptation had reached a level of quiet efficiency. Outwardly, nothing had changed. He remained consistent in his duties, predictable in his behavior, and aligned with the expectations of military life. Those around him saw reliability, routine, stability, and that was precisely what made everything else so difficult to detect, because beneath that surface, the internal world that had been developing since childhood was no longer passive. It was active, structured, and increasingly influential in how he experienced his surroundings. The environment of life at sea continued to reinforce this duality. There is a particular kind of isolation that exists even in crowded spaces, an isolation that is not defined by physical distance, but by emotional separation. A person can be surrounded by others, engaged in shared routines, and still feel entirely alone within their own thoughts. For Armstrong, this form of isolation may have deepened the internal patterns he had carried for years. There were few opportunities for meaningful reflection with others. Conversations, while present, remained on the surface. Interactions were functional, not deeply personal. And without those deeper connections, the internal world remained largely unchallenged. This absence of challenge is significant because thoughts, when left unexamined, can evolve in ways that feel logical to the individual, even if they diverge from broader reality. Without external input, there is no counterbalance, no perspective to question or reshape what is being experienced internally. And so, the internal narrative continues to develop. For Armstrong, that narrative had become increasingly complex. There was a growing sense of separation, not just from others, but from the version of himself that existed on the surface. The mask was still there, still functioning, still effective. But it was no longer the entirety of his identity. That it was a one that he played consistently, but one that did not fully represent what was happening beneath it. This is where the concept of a double life becomes more than just a metaphor, that it becomes a lived experience. Two identities, existing simultaneously. One visible, one hidden. One structured by external expectations, the other shaped by internal processes. And as these two identities continue to develop, they do not always remain equal. One begins to take precedence that to exert more influence that to shape perception in ways that gradually alter behavior that at first. These changes are subtle that a shift in how situations are interpreted, that a difference in how others are perceived, a growing sense that the internal world holds more significance than the external one, that these shifts do not immediately disrupt routine. They do not draw attention, but they are important nonetheless, because they mark the beginning of a transition from passive internal experience to active influence. That Armstrong's mobility during this time played a crucial role in allowing this transition to continue uninterrupted. Each new port, each new location, offered a form of anonymity, a sense that past contexts did not fully apply, that identity could remain consistent outwardly, even as internal changes continued to unfold. There were no long-term observers and no consistent relationships that might notice gradual changes over time. And without that continuity, the process remained largely invisible. This invisibility is a recurring theme, not just in how Armstrong was perceived by others, but in how his internal world developed without interference. Because when something remains unseen for long enough, it can grow without limitation, without boundaries, without correction, and over time, that growth can lead to something more tangible, something that moves beyond thought, beyond internal experience, into action. At this stage, that transition had not yet fully occurred, but the conditions for it were forming. The internal world had become structured and active. The external world remained stable and unchallenging, and the boundary between the two was becoming less rigid. There is also something to be said about routine. Routine, while often stabilizing, can also create a sense of monotony, a repetition that, over time, leads to a desire for variation, for something different, something that breaks the pattern. For most people, this might manifest in harmless ways, seeking new experiences, new environments, new challenges. But when the internal world is already complex and unexamined, that desire for variation can take on a different form. It can become intertwined with internal impulses, with thoughts that have been developing over time. And when those two elements intersect, monotony and internal complexity, the result can be unpredictable. For Armstrong, this intersection was approaching. The routine of life at sea continued. The mask remained intact. The external life was unchanged. But beneath it, the internal world was no longer content to remain entirely separate. It was pressing outward, gradually, quietly, but persistently. And with each passing moment, the balance between concealment and expression became more fragile, more uncertain, more difficult to maintain indefinitely. Because while a person can live within two realities for a time, eventually, those realities begin to intersect. And when they do, the results can no longer remain hidden. By the end of this chapter, the stage is set, not with visible action, but with internal transformation. A transformation that has been years in the making. Point one, that has unfolded in silence, beneath a carefully maintained exterior, and one that is now approaching a point where it will begin to surface, not all at once, not dramatically, but in ways that will gradually reveal what has been hidden all along. Chapter 6. The emergence of a pattern no one saw. There is a point in certain stories where the unseen begins to leave traces, not enough to alarm, not enough to disrupt, but enough to suggest that something, somewhere beneath the surface, has shifted from possibility into reality. For John Eric Armstrong, this transition did not arrive with noise or immediate recognition. It did not draw attention to itself. Instead, it unfolded in the same way much of his life had, quietly, without witnesses who understood its meaning, because patterns rarely announce themselves when they begin. They emerge gradually, point one moment at a time. And unless those moments are connected, they remain invisible. By this stage, the internal evolution that had been building for years had reached a point where it could no longer remain entirely contained. The boundary between thought and action, once firm and reliable, had softened, and in that softening, something new began to take shape. That at first, it would not have appeared significant. There were no immediate signals to those around him, no outward changes in demeanor that would have suggested a shift. Armstrong continued to maintain the same controlled exterior, the same calm presence, the same unremarkable behavior that had defined him for so long. But beneath that exterior, the internal patterns had begun to influence action, not in a way that was visible to others, not in a way that disrupted his routine, but in ways that marked a clear departure from what had come before. This is often how patterns begin, not as large, unmistakable events, but as small, isolated moments. Moments that, on their own, seem disconnected. Moments that do not attract attention because they do not appear to form a larger narrative. But over time, those moments begin to align. They begin to follow a rhythm, a consistency. And that is when a pattern truly exists. That Armstrong's life at this point was still defined by movement. Different locations, different environments, different levels of anonymity. Each new place offered the same opportunity to exist without being fully known, to move without leaving a clear trace. And within that movement, the emerging pattern remained hidden. There is something uniquely difficult about identifying patterns that span multiple locations. Without a central point of reference, events that might otherwise seem connected remain separate. They exist in isolation, scattered across different contexts, never fully brought together. And that separation creates invisibility. For Armstrong, this meant that the early stages of his behavioral shift did not immediately register as anything unusual, because no one was seeing the full picture. No one was connecting the moments. No one was aware that a pattern was forming. This is where the concept of hiding in plain sight takes on a deeper meaning. It is not just about blending into a single environment. It is about existing across multiple environments in a way that prevents a cohesive understanding of behavior. Each place sees only a fragment, and fragments, on their own, rarely tell the full story. As the pattern began to develop, Armstrong's internal world and external actions became more closely aligned. The thoughts that had once remained internal were now finding expression, not all at once. Not in a way that would immediately draw attention, but in a series of moments that, over time, would form a consistent trajectory. And yet, despite this shift, his outward identity remained unchanged. He was still the same person to those around him, still quiet, still composed, still entirely unremarkable. And that contrast, the coexistence of normalcy and hidden behavior, is what allowed the pattern to continue without interruption, because people tend to trust what they see. They rely on outward behavior to form judgments, and when that behavior aligns with expectations, there is little reason to look deeper. Armstrong understood this dynamic. Whether consciously or not, he maintained his outward consistency with precision. He did not draw attention. He did not deviate from expected behavior in ways that would raise concern. And because of that, the emerging pattern remained concealed. There is also something to consider about the nature of patterns themselves. Once a pattern begins, it reinforces itself. Each instance makes the next more likely. Each action, no matter how small, contributes to a growing sense of familiarity. And over time, what was once new becomes routine. For Armstrong, this process was unfolding quietly. The internal had become external, but in a way that was controlled, measured, and carefully contained within the boundaries of his outward normalcy. N01 around him could see the connection. N01 could recognize the trajectory. And so, the pattern continued. Unseen, unquestioned, there is a certain inevitability to this stage of development. Once the boundary between thought and action has been crossed, even in the smallest way, it changes the landscape entirely. IT redefines what is possible. It alters perception, and it creates a pathway that, once established, becomes easier to follow over time. For Armstrong, that pathway was now in place. Not fully visible, not fully understood, but undeniably present. And with each passing moment, it became more defined, more consistent, more real. Yet still, to the outside world, nothing had changed. That he remained the same person they had always known. Or rather, the same person they believed they knew. And that belief, so strong, so unquestioned, was what allowed everything else to remain hidden. Because the most effective concealment is not created through deception alone. It is created through expectation, through the assumption that what is seen is all that exists. And for Armstrong, that assumption remained firmly in place, even as the reality beneath it continued to evolve. Once a pattern begins, it rarely stays contained within isolated moments. It starts to develop a rhythm, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from randomness, but gradually becoming more defined. The intervals between actions may shift. The circumstances may vary. But beneath those differences, there is a consistency forming. A structure. A quiet repetition that only becomes visible when viewed as a whole. For John Eric Armstrong, this stage marked a significant turning point. Not because anything had suddenly changed on the surface, but because what had begun internally was now establishing itself externally in a way that could continue. The most unsettling aspect of this transition is how easily it can remain unnoticed, because when individual moments are separated by time and distance, they do not immediately suggest a pattern. They appear unrelated, disconnected, each one existing on its own, without context. And without context, there is no reason to question. Armstrong's life, still defined by movement and routine, provided the perfect conditions for this separation to persist. Each new environment functioned as its own contained world. What happened in one place did not necessarily carry over into the next, at least not in a way that others could perceive. This fragmentation allowed the emerging pattern to continue without interruption. That N01 was tracking it. N01 was connecting the details. N01 was aware that these isolated moments were part of something larger. And so, the pattern grew. There is something important to understand about repetition. Each time an action is repeated, it becomes more familiar, less uncertain. The hesitation that might have existed at the beginning begins to fade. The boundary that once felt significant becomes easier to cross. And over time, what was once unfamiliar becomes routine. For Armstrong, this process unfolded quietly. The internal world that had been developing for years had now found a way to express itself in the external world, without disrupting the mask he had so carefully maintained. That mask remained intact, unchanged. Effective, he continued to present himself in the same way. Calm, controlled, unremarkable. There were no outward signs of escalation, no visible shifts that would have drawn attention. And that consistency was what made everything else possible. Because when the exterior remains stable, the interior is rarely questioned. People trust patterns they can see. They rely on behavior that aligns with expectations. And when those expectations are met consistently, there is little reason to look deeper. Armstrong's ability to maintain this outward stability allowed the internal pattern to continue developing without interference. It is also worth considering how perception plays a role in this stage. As the pattern becomes more established, the individual's understanding of their own behavior can shift. What once may have felt uncertain or unfamiliar begins to feel more controlled, more intentional, more integrated into their sense of self. This does not necessarily mean that there is a clear, conscious acknowledgement of what is happening, but it does mean that the behavior becomes less separate from identity, more aligned with it. For Armstrong, this alignment marked a deeper level of internal change. The separation between who he appeared to be and what he was doing had not disappeared, but it had become more complex, more interconnected. The two realities were no longer entirely separate. They were beginning to influence one another. And yet, from the outside, nothing appeared different. This is the paradox at the center of the story, that a man whose external life remains unchanged, whose behavior appears consistent, whose presence does not raise concern, and yet, beneath that surface, a pattern is forming that no one can see, that a pattern that spans locations, moments, and time, that a pattern that exists entirely outside the awareness of those around him. There is also an element of timing in how patterns develop. They do not always follow predictable intervals. They are influenced by environment, opportunity, and internal state. And because of this variability, they are even more difficult to detect. For Armstrong, this variability worked in his favor. The lack of a consistent, visible timeline made it harder for anyone to recognize what was happening. There were no obvious connections, no clear sequence that could be easily identified. And without that sequence, the pattern remained hidden. But hidden does not mean non-existent. It simply means unrecognized. And unrecognized patterns can continue for long periods without interruption. As this stage progressed, the internal tension that had been building for years began to find a kind of equilibrium. Not a resolution, but a balance, a way of existing that allowed both the internal and external realities to continue side by side. The mask remained, the pattern continued, and the two coexisted without immediate conflict. But this balance was not permanent, because as patterns become more established, they tend to evolve, they expand, they intensify, and eventually, they reach a point where they can no longer remain entirely hidden. At this stage, Armstrong had not yet reached that point. The pattern was still developing, still concealed, still operating beneath the surface, but it was no longer in its earliest phase. It had moved beyond isolated moments, beyond subtle shifts. It had become something more consistent, more structured, more real. And with each passing moment, it moved closer to becoming visible, not because it changed outwardly, but because patterns, once established, tend to leave traces, and traces, when noticed, begin to tell a story. For now, though, those traces remain scattered, unconnected, invisible to those who might have understood their significance. And so, the pattern continued, quietly, steadily, unseen. Chapter 7. Victims without a voice. The invisible targets. There are stories that unfold loudly, cases where attention gathers quickly, where events are noticed, documented, and followed in real time. And then there are others that pass quietly through the world, leaving behind only faint traces, often overlooked or misunderstood. This chapter belongs to the latter, because one of the most unsettling aspects of this story is not only what was happening, but who it was happening to. In many cases, the individuals affected were people who lived on the edges of visibility. People whose lives did not always intersect with systems that might track their movements or notice their absence immediately. People who existed within spaces that were often overlooked by the broader public. And because of that, their stories did not always receive immediate attention. This is an important and difficult truth. Not all lives are observed equally. Not all disappearances are treated with the same urgency. And not all patterns are recognized when the individuals involved are already, in many ways, unseen. As John Eric Armstrong's pattern continued to develop, the environments he moved through brought him into contact with a wide range of individuals, different cities, different countries, different social contexts. And within those contexts, there were people whose circumstances made them particularly vulnerable, not because of anything they had done, but because of the way society often overlooks certain groups. These were individuals living transient lives, people without strong support systems, people who, for various reasons, were not consistently connected to structures that might notice when something was wrong. And in that lack of connection, there was a kind of invisibility, a silence point, one that made it easier for patterns to continue without immediate recognition. It is essential, in telling this story, to approach these individuals with respect and awareness. They are not defined by the circumstances that made them vulnerable. They are not simply part of a narrative. They were people, with lives, histories, and identities that extended far beyond the moments in which they intersected with Armstrong's path. But in the context of this story, their invisibility within broader systems played a role in how long the pattern remained hidden. Because when someone disappears from a space where they were not consistently seen to begin with, the absence can go unnoticed, or at least unrecognized as part of something larger. This is where the pattern's concealment becomes even more complex. It is not just about Armstrong's ability to blend in. It is also about the environments in which he operated, places where anonymity was common, where individuals came and went without leaving detailed records, where interactions were brief, often transactional, and rarely followed up. In such environments, it becomes difficult to establish continuity. Track movement. Connect events across time and place. And without that continuity, patterns remain fragmented, unseen. Armstrong's interactions during this period were shaped by these conditions. He moved through spaces where he was not known in depth, where he could maintain his outward normalcy without interference. And within those same spaces, he encountered individuals whose own visibility within the system was limited. This intersection between someone who had mastered invisibility and individuals who were already unseen created a situation where patterns could continue without immediate detection. There is a quiet tragedy in this, not only in what was happening, but in how long it took to be recognized. Because recognition often depends on visibility, on connection, on the presence of systems that can identify when something is wrong. And when those systems are absent or inconsistent, it becomes much more difficult to see the full picture. At this stage, the pattern had already moved beyond isolated moments. It had become something more consistent, more structured, but still, it remained largely invisible to the outside world. Because the individuals involved were not always part of systems that would connect the dots, their stories were not immediately linked. Their absences were not always seen as part of a larger pattern. And so, the pattern continued. There is also an important psychological element to consider here. For someone who has developed a strong internal world, shaped by years of detachment and observation, interactions can take on a different meaning, not necessarily in a way that is immediately visible, but in how they are perceived internally, the way others are viewed, the way situations are interpreted, and as these perceptions evolve, they begin to influence behavior. For Armstrong, this shift had already begun in earlier chapters. Now, it was becoming more integrated into his actions. But once again, this integration did not disrupt his outward identity. That he remained composed, controlled, unremarkable to those around him. Nothing appeared out of place, and that consistency allowed everything else to remain hidden. This is the paradox at the center of this chapter, that a pattern that is growing more defined, that a set of interactions that, when viewed together, would reveal something significant. And yet, each individual moment remains isolated, unconnected, because the individuals involved were not consistently seen, not consistently tracked, not consistently recognized as part of a larger narrative. And so, their stories remain separate for now. But as with all patterns, there comes a point where separation is no longer enough to conceal the whole, where connections begin to form, where traces begin to align, where the invisible starts to become visible. At this stage, that point had not yet fully arrived, but the conditions for it were forming, because patterns, no matter how well concealed, have a tendency to leave behind something, that a trace, the detail, a connection that, once noticed, begins to change everything. For now, though, the story remains quiet. The pattern continues, and the individuals at the center of it remain, in many ways, unseen. As the pattern continued to unfold, what made it especially difficult to detect was not just its quiet nature, but the way it intersected with environments already shaped by uncertainty, movement, and anonymity. In these spaces, people came and went without clear timelines. Connections were brief. Identities were often known only in fragments. And because of that, the absence of someone did not always create immediate alarm. That it is a difficult reality to confront, that entire lives can exist on the margins of visibility, that some individuals move through the world without the safety net of constant recognition, without systems that track their presence or notice when something changes. And in those margins, silence can linger far longer than it should. For John Eric Armstrong, this environment allowed the pattern to continue without interruption. Each interaction remained contained within its own moment, rarely extending beyond it. There were no immediate connections linking one instance to another, no overarching narrative forming in real time that anyone observing from the outside. If anyone had been observing closely enough, there would have been no clear indication that these moments were part of something larger, and so the pattern remained fragmented. There is also a psychological layer to this stage that cannot be ignored. When actions begin to repeat, they create familiarity, not just in behavior, but in perception. What once might have felt uncertain becomes more defined. The internal understanding of those actions shifts, becoming more integrated into the individual's sense of reality. For Armstrong, this meant that the internal and external worlds were no longer separate in the way they once had been. They were beginning to overlap. The thoughts that had once existed in isolation were now directly influencing behavior. And that behavior, in turn, reinforced the internal patterns that had developed over time. It is a cycle, a feedback loop. Point one, that becomes more stable with each repetition. And yet, despite this internal consolidation, the outward appearance remained unchanged. This is where the true complexity of the situation lies, because while the internal world was becoming more structured and influential, the external world continued to see only what it had always seen. A quiet, controlled individual, someone who did not draw attention, someone who fit within expectations. And because that image remained consistent, there was no immediate reason to question it. This is how invisibility persists, not through complete absence, but through the presence of something that appears entirely normal. Armstrong's ability to maintain this outward consistency allowed the pattern to continue developing without interference. There were no interruptions, no external challenges that forced a reevaluation of behavior. And in the absence of those challenges, the cycle continued. It is also important to reflect on how systems respond, or fail to respond, in situations like this. When events are isolated, When individuals are not consistently tracked, when information is scattered across different locations, it becomes incredibly difficult to form a cohesive understanding of what is happening. Each piece of information exists on its own, disconnected, incomplete, and without a way to bring those pieces together. The larger picture remains hidden. For Armstrong, this meant that even as the pattern became more established, it was still not recognized as such. There were no immediate links connecting the moments in a centralized awareness, in a unified narrative. And so, everything continued as it had, quietly, unnoticed, but patterns, by their nature, do not remain static. They evolve, they expand, and eventually, they begin to leave. Traces that are harder to ignore at first. Those traces may still be subtle, that a detail that doesn't quite fit, that a question that lingers without an answer, that a moment that stands out just enough to be remembered. Individually, these traces may not seem significant, but over time, they begin to accumulate. And when enough of them come together, they start to form something recognizable, a pattern that be why the end of this chapter. That recognition has not yet fully occurred. The pattern is still operating beneath the surface, still fragmented, still largely invisible. But the conditions are beginning to change, because the more a pattern repeats, the more likely it is to leave behind something that can be traced, something that can be connected, something that, when viewed alongside other details, begins to tell a story. And once that story begins to take shape, it becomes much more difficult to ignore. For now, though, the silence remains. The individuals at the center of this chapter, those whose lives intersected with Armstrong's, are still not part of a larger narrative in the eyes of the world. Their stories remain separate, their absences unconnected, but that will not last forever, because patterns, no matter how well concealed, have a way of revealing themselves over time. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, through the accumulation of details, through the persistence of traces, through the quiet emergence of something that can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And when that moment arrives, everything begins to change. Chapter 8. A Killer in Plain Sight. Missed warnings and overlooked signs. There is a certain discomfort in looking back at events that, in hindsight, seem as though they should have been noticed. Small details, subtle moments, things that, when viewed individually, appear insignificant, but when placed together, form something far more revealing. This chapter exists in that space, the space between what was seen and what was understood, because one of the most unsettling aspects of John Eric Armstrong's story is not just that he remained hidden, but that he remained hidden in environments where, theoretically, someone could have noticed something. And yet, no one did, or perhaps more accurately, no one connected what they saw into something that required deeper attention. This is not uncommon. Human perception is guided by expectation. We see what we are prepared to see. We interpret behavior based on what we believe to be normal. And when someone consistently aligns with those expectations, it becomes difficult to recognize when something does not quite fit. Armstrong had spent years perfecting that alignment, that he knew how to exist within the boundaries of normal behavior. He understood how to respond appropriately, how to present himself in a way that did not invite scrutiny. His outward identity remained stable, predictable, and entirely unremarkable. And because of that, any subtle deviations were easy to overlook. There may have been moments, brief, fleeting instances where something felt slightly off, a tone that lingered too long, a reaction that didn't fully match the situation, a detail that, at the time, did not seem important enough to question. These are the kinds of moments that rarely stand out in real time. They are dismissed, explained away, forgotten, but in hindsight, they take on a different meaning. They become part of a pattern, part of a larger picture that was not visible at the time. In Armstrong's case, his environments continued to play a significant role in maintaining this invisibility. The mobility of his life meant that he was rarely in one place long enough for others to observe consistent behavioral patterns over time. Each new setting came with new people, individuals who had no prior context, no baseline for comparison. And without that baseline, it becomes much harder to recognize change. What might seem unusual to someone who has known a person for years may appear entirely normal to someone meeting them for the first time. This lack of continuity worked in Armstrong's favor. It allowed him to maintain the same outward identity across different environments, without the risk of someone noticing a gradual shift. But even within those environments, there were still moments, small, subtle indicators that something was not entirely aligned with the surface image. The challenge is that these indicators did not present themselves as obvious warning signs. They were not dramatic. They did not demand attention. They existed in the margins, and in those margins, they were easy to miss. There is also a psychological tendency to avoid jumping to conclusions. People are generally inclined to give others the benefit of the doubt, to assume that behavior has a reasonable explanation, to avoid interpreting something as concerning unless there is clear evidence. This tendency, while often positive, can also contribute to missed signals, because it creates a bias toward normalcy a reluctance to question what appears to be ordinary. And in Armstrong's case, that bias remained strong. He continued to present himself as someone who fit within expectations, someone who did not stand out, someone who did not give others a reason to look closer. And because of that, the subtle indicators that did exist were not enough to override that perception. They remained isolated, unconnected, and ultimately unnoticed. There is a broader lesson here, one that extends beyond this specific story. The idea that warning signs are always obvious is a misconception. In many cases, they are not. They are subtle, context-dependent, easily explained away, and often only recognizable when viewed in hindsight. Armstrong's ability to maintain his outward identity meant that any potential signs were filtered through the lens of normalcy. They were interpreted in ways that aligned with what people already believed about him, and that belief acted as a kind of shield, protecting the illusion, reinforcing the assumption that everything was as it appeared. This is how someone can exist in plain sight, not by being invisible in a literal sense, but by being perceived in a way that prevents deeper questioning. Armstrong was seen, but he was not truly understood. And that distinction is critical, because being seen does not guarantee being known. It does not ensure that underlying patterns are recognized. It does not prevent something from remaining hidden beneath the surface. At this stage, the pattern that had been developing was still not fully visible to the outside world. The individuals involved remained unconnected in the broader narrative. The traces that existed had not yet been brought together, and the subtle indicators, those small moments that might have hinted at something more, remain scattered. But as patterns continue, they tend to leave behind more than just isolated traces. They begin to create inconsistencies, details that do not fully align, questions that, over time, become harder to ignore. And while those questions had not yet reached a point of recognition, they were beginning to form quietly in the background, waiting for the moment when they would finally come into focus. As time moved forward, the subtle inconsistencies that once existed as isolated moments began to gather weight, though not yet in a way that was immediately recognized. They lingered in memory, faint and unformed, like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet been placed together. Individually, they meant very little, but collectively, they were beginning to matter. This is often how overlooked signs function. They do not present themselves as urgent or alarming. Instead, they exist in the background, small deviations from expectation that are easy to dismiss in the moment, a conversation that feels slightly off, a detail that doesn't quite fit, a presence that seems normal, yet leaves behind a subtle sense of unease that cannot easily be explained. Most people experience moments like this and move past them. They attribute them to coincidence, to misunderstanding, to the natural variation in human behavior. And in most cases, that interpretation is correct, but sometimes it isn't. For John Eric Armstrong, the accumulation of these subtle inconsistencies did not immediately lead to suspicion. His outward behavior remained steady, consistent, and aligned with what others expected to see. And that consistency continued to protect him. It created a framework through which everything else was interpreted. When something did not quite fit, it was measured against the larger image of normalcy, and the larger image prevailed. This is a powerful effect, because once a person is categorized as ordinary, it becomes difficult to reinterpret their actions in a different light. New information is filtered through that existing perception. It is adjusted, explained, or dismissed in ways that preserve the original understanding. Armstrong benefited from this effect repeatedly. Even as small irregularities emerged, they were not enough to disrupt the overall perception of who he was believed to be. There is also an element of timing in how recognition occurs. For a pattern to be identified, there must be a point where enough information converges to form a coherent picture. Before that point, details remain scattered, incomplete, and open to interpretation. In Armstrong's case, that convergence had not yet fully happened. The environments he moved through remained fragmented. The individuals who encountered him did so in isolation, without knowledge of other interactions, and the traces left behind, while present, had not yet been connected. This fragmentation delayed recognition. It allowed the pattern to continue developing without interruption, but it also meant that, when recognition did come, it would arrive all at once, bringing with it a realization that had been building quietly for some time. There is something deeply unsettling about this moment of realization, the point where scattered details suddenly align, where isolated memories take on new meaning, where the ordinary becomes something else entirely, because it forces a reevaluation, not just of events, but of perception. Of how something could have remained hidden despite being, in some sense, visible all along. For Armstrong, that moment had not yet fully arrived, but it was approaching. The accumulation of subtle signs was reaching a threshold, not yet enough to expose the full pattern, but enough to begin shifting the way certain details were understood. There may have been individuals who, in retrospect, recalled moments that seemed unusual, instances that, at the time, did not stand out, but later took on a different significance. This is often how hindsight works. It reorganizes memory. It highlights what was previously overlooked. It connects details that once seemed unrelated. But in the moment, those connections are rarely clear, and so the pattern continues. There is also an important emotional component to this stage. People do not easily accept the idea that something serious could be unfolding unnoticed in their environment. There is a natural resistance to that possibility, a tendency to trust that if something were truly wrong, it would be obvious, that someone would have noticed, that something would have been done. But reality is often more complex. Not everything announces itself. Not everything is immediately recognized, and not every pattern is visible in real time. Armstrong's ability to exist within this gap, between visibility and recognition, was what allowed everything to continue as it had. He was seen, interacted with, accepted, but never fully understood, and that distinction remained in place. Even as the subtle signs began to accumulate, be why the end of this chapter, the stage is set for a shift. The pattern is no longer in its earliest phase. The traces are no longer entirely isolated. There is a growing sense, however faint, that something does not fully align. But that sense has not yet solidified into recognition that IT remains just out of reach, just beyond clarity. And that is what makes this moment so significant, because it exists at the edge of understanding, the point where everything is still hidden, but no longer entirely invisible, where the illusion of normalcy is still intact, but beginning to show strain, and where the truth, though not yet fully revealed, is closer than it has ever been. Chapter 9. The Psychology of Control and Compulsion. There is a point in stories like this where understanding shifts from what happened to why it continued. Not in a way that excuses, not in a way that simplifies, but in a way that attempts to examine the internal mechanisms that allowed everything to unfold over time. Because patterns, especially ones that remain hidden for so long, are rarely random. They are shaped by perception, reinforced by repetition, and sustained by something deeper than circumstance alone. For John Eric Armstrong, the concept of control sits at the center of this stage. Not control in the visible sense. He had already demonstrated that through his ability to maintain a stable outward life, he could follow routines, meet expectations, and exist within structured environments without disruption. That kind of control was already established. What becomes more relevant here is internal control. Or more precisely, the shifting balance between control and compulsion. In earlier chapters, there was a clear boundary between Armstrong's internal world and his external behavior. Thoughts remained contained. Actions remained aligned with expectations. The two existed separately, without significant overlap. But as the pattern developed, that separation began to change. The internal no longer remained entirely internal. And with that shift came a new dynamic. Because when thoughts begin to influence behavior consistently, they take on a different quality. They become part of a cycle. A loop that reinforces itself over time. At first, this loop may still feel controlled, intentional, something that can be started or stopped. But as it repeats, the nature of that control begins to change. It becomes less about choice and more about momentum. This is where the idea of compulsion enters the picture, not as an immediate loss of control, but as a gradual shift, a movement from deliberate action to patterned behavior, from decision to expectation. For Armstrong, this shift did not happen abruptly. It developed over time, shaped by repetition and the absence of interruption. Each instance reinforced the internal pattern. Each repetition made the behavior more familiar, more integrated, and with familiarity comes a certain kind of normalization. What once may have felt distinct or separate begins to feel like part of a routine, part of an internal rhythm. And once something becomes part of a rhythm, it no longer requires the same level of conscious decision making. It becomes automatic. This is one of the most complex aspects of human behavior. The way repetition can transform actions into patterns and patterns into something that feels inherent, something that no longer feels like a deviation, but like a continuation. For Armstrong, this internal transformation was occurring alongside an outward life that remained unchanged. He still maintained his composure, still fulfilled his responsibilities, still presented himself as someone entirely within the bounds of normal behavior. And that contrast, the coexistence of internal compulsion and external control, is what made the situation so difficult to recognize. Because from the outside, there was no visible loss of control. No disruption. No indication that anything had shifted. But internally, the experience was different. The pattern had become established. The cycle had begun to reinforce itself. and the sense of control, while still present, was no longer absolute. There is also an important distinction to make here. Control and compulsion are not always opposites. They can exist simultaneously. A person can maintain control in certain areas of their life while experiencing compulsion in others. They can function normally in structured environments, while internal patterns operate beneath the surface. And this duality is what often allows such situations to continue. Because the presence of control in one area masks the loss of control in another, for Armstrong, this duality remained intact. He was still capable of maintaining his outward identity, still able to navigate social expectations, still able to exist within systems that required discipline and consistency. And, because of that, the internal pattern remained hidden, unchallenged, uninterrupted. But as with all cycles, there is a tendency toward escalation, not necessarily in a dramatic or sudden way, but in a gradual intensification. As patterns repeat, they often become more pronounced, more defined, more central to the individual's internal experience. And as they become more central, they begin to influence more aspects of perception and behavior. For Armstrong, this meant that the internal pattern was no longer isolated. It was becoming a defining feature of his experience. A framework through which he interpreted the world. And once a pattern reaches that level of integration, it becomes much more difficult to separate from it, because it is no longer just something that happens. It is something that feels embedded, something that shapes identity. At this stage, the pattern was firmly established. The internal cycle of control and compulsion had taken form, and while the outward appearance remained unchanged, the internal landscape had shifted in a way that would continue to influence everything that followed. There is a quiet inevitability to this stage, not because the outcome is predetermined, but because the conditions that sustain the pattern are still in place. There has been no interruption. No recognition. No external force that challenges what has been developing. And in the absence of those things, the cycle continues steadily, quietly, reinforcing itself with each passing moment. As the cycle of behavior becomes more established, something subtle but significant begins to change, not just in action, but in perception. The way the world is experienced starts to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that would be immediately visible to others, but internally. The framework through which situations are understood becomes more structured, more fixed, and increasingly influenced by the pattern that has taken hold. For John Eric Armstrong, this stage represents a deepening of that internal framework. What had once been a separation between thought and action had now become a continuous loop, each reinforcing the other. The internal world no longer existed independently of behavior. It was now shaping it directly, guiding it in ways that felt consistent, even expected. And this is where the concept of normalization becomes critical, because once a pattern is repeated enough times, it begins to lose its sense of exception. It no longer feels like something outside the norm. It becomes part of the norm, part of the internal logic that defines how the individual experiences reality. This does not mean there is a conscious acknowledgement of this shift. In many cases, it happens gradually, without clear awareness. The mind adapts. It integrates. It restructures itself around the pattern. And once that restructuring occurs, the behavior no longer feels separate from identity. It feels aligned with it. For Armstrong, this alignment marked a deeper level of integration. The internal and external were no longer operating as distinctly separate systems. They were interconnected, influencing one another in a way that created consistency, not in outward appearance, but in internal experience. And yet, the outward appearance remained unchanged. This is the paradox that continues to define this story. A man who appears stable, controlled, and entirely ordinary, and an internal reality that has evolved into something far more complex. This duality is what allowed everything to continue without interruption, because from the outside, there was no visible disruption. No clear indication that anything had shifted, but internally, the pattern had become central. There is also an important aspect of repetition to consider here. Repetition does not just reinforce behavior. It shapes expectation. It creates a sense of predictability. A rhythm. And once that rhythm is established, deviations from it can feel uncomfortable, unsettling. Even if those deviations represent a return to what might once have been considered normal. In this way, the pattern begins to sustain itself, not just through action, but through the internal need to maintain consistency. For Armstrong, this meant that the cycle was no longer just something that occurred. It was something that was expected, something that had become part of his internal structure. And when a pattern reaches that level, it becomes much more difficult to disrupt. Because disruption requires awareness, it requires recognition, it requires an external force that challenges the internal logic. And at this stage, none of those elements were present. There was no interruption, no moment of clarity that forced a reevaluation, no external pressure that demanded change. And so, the cycle continued. There is also a broader psychological principle at play here. The idea that behavior, once reinforced, tends to persist unless something actively intervenes. This is not unique to this case. It is a general aspect of human behavior. Patterns continue because they are allowed to continue, because they are not interrupted, because they are not recognized as needing change. For Armstrong, this lack of interruption was critical. It allowed the internal pattern to develop fully. Without resistance, it allowed the cycle of control and compulsion to stabilize. And it allowed the duality between his outward life and internal experience to remain intact. But no pattern, no matter how stable, exists in isolation forever. Over time, external factors begin to intersect with internal ones. Details accumulate, traces align, and the environment that once allowed invisibility begins to shift. At this stage, that shift had not yet fully occurred, but the conditions for it were forming, because as patterns continue, they tend to leave behind something that can be observed, something that, when recognized, begins to challenge the illusion of normalcy. For Armstrong, that moment was approaching. The internal cycle had reached a point of stability. The pattern had become integrated, and the outward appearance remained unchanged. But beneath that stability, the system was under strain, not visible strain, not something that disrupted behavior, but a tension that existed between the internal and external worlds. A tension that could not remain perfectly balanced indefinitely. Because while the mind can sustain dual realities for a time, it cannot do so without consequence. Eventually, something shifts, something becomes visible. And when that happens, the entire structure begins to change. By the end of this chapter, that moment has not yet arrived. The pattern remains intact. The cycle continues, and the illusion of normalcy remains unbroken. But beneath that illusion, the internal framework has been fully established, and once something reaches that level of integration, it is only a matter of time before it begins to intersect with the outside world in a way that can no longer be ignored. Chapter 10. The investigation that almost didn't happen. There is a moment in many hidden stories when the silence begins to fracture. Not loudly, not all at once, but just enough for something to be noticed, at a detail that doesn't disappear, at a question that lingers a little longer than it should, at a trace that refuses to be dismissed. For John Eric Armstrong, that moment did not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It came slowly, almost reluctantly, as scattered pieces of information began to surface in ways that could no longer remain entirely separate. Until now, everything had existed in fragments, different locations, different individuals, different moments in time, each one isolated, each one incomplete. And because of that, the larger pattern remained hidden. But patterns, no matter how carefully concealed, have a tendency to leave behind something that, when viewed from the right angle, begins to connect. At first, these connections were faint, subtle, not enough to form a clear picture, but enough to raise questions. And questions, once they begin, have a way of persisting. The difficulty, however, was not just in recognizing the pattern. It was in assembling it, because the events that made up this story were not confined to a single place. They did not occur within one consistent jurisdiction, one community, or one timeline that could be easily tracked. They were scattered across cities, across regions, across contexts that did not naturally communicate with one another. And this fragmentation created a significant barrier. Information existed, but it was not centralized. Details were present, but they were not connected. And without connection, there was no narrative and no clear indication that these moments were part of something larger. This is why the investigation, in its earliest stages, was not an investigation at all. That it was a series of isolated observations, individual reports, unrelated concerns that did not yet form a cohesive picture. In many cases, these observations did not immediately suggest anything unusual. They existed within environments where uncertainty was already present, where movement and anonymity were common. And because of that, they did not stand out. They blended into the background, just as Armstrong himself had done for years. But slowly, something began to change, not in a way that was immediately obvious, but in a way that created a subtle shift in perspective. Certain details began to align, certain patterns, though still incomplete, started to emerge. And with that emergence came a realization, not a full understanding, not a complete picture, but a recognition that something did not fully make sense, that the fragments, when viewed together, might represent something more. This is often how investigations begin, not with certainty, but with doubt, with the sense that something is off, that what appears to be unrelated may, in fact, be connected. And once that possibility is considered, it becomes difficult to ignore. For those who first encountered these emerging details, the challenge was immense. There was no clear starting point, no obvious suspect, no single event that defined the situation. Instead, there were fragments, and the task was to determine whether those fragments belonged to the same story. This process requires patience, attention to detail, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to question assumptions. Because for years, the assumption had been that everything was as it appeared, that the ordinary was truly ordinary, that the lack of visible connection meant the absence of one. But now, that assumption was beginning to shift. The possibility of a hidden pattern introduced a new way of looking at the information. Details that once seemed insignificant began to take on new meaning. Moments that had been dismissed were reconsidered, and slowly, the fragments began to move closer together, still incomplete, still uncertain, but no longer entirely separate. For Armstrong, this shift was not immediately visible. His outward life remained unchanged. He continued to present himself in the same way. Calm, controlled, unremarkable. There were no signs, from his perspective, that anything had changed. The mask remained intact, the routine continued, and the illusion of normalcy persisted. But outside of that illusion, something was beginning to take shape. Not a full investigation, not yet, but the early stages of awareness. The recognition that there might be more beneath the surface than had previously been understood. This stage is often the most fragile because it exists between uncertainty and clarity. There is enough information to raise questions, but not enough to answer them. Enough to suggest a pattern, but not enough to confirm it. And in that space, the outcome is not guaranteed because recognition can still be missed, connections can still fail to form, and patterns can still remain hidden. For Armstrong, this meant that the emerging awareness did not immediately disrupt what had been happening. The pattern continued, the outward. Life remained stable, and the gap between appearance and reality persisted. But the difference now was subtle, yet significant. The pattern was no longer entirely invisible, that it was beginning to be sensed, not fully seen, not fully understood, but sensed. And once something is sensed, it becomes much harder to ignore. When awareness first begins, it rarely arrives with certainty. That it comes as a feeling before it becomes a fact, that a sense that something is not fully aligned, that a quiet tension between what is known and what might be hidden beneath it. For those who began to notice the early fragments connected to John Eric Armstrong, this was the stage they found themselves in, a place of uncertainty, where questions existed without clear answers, and where every new detail had the potential to either clarify or complicate everything further. The challenge was not simply gathering information, that it was interpreting it, understanding whether the fragments truly belonged together or whether they were simply coincidental. And in situations like this, coincidence is often the most comfortable explanation, because it requires no further action, no deeper investigation, no unsettling realization that something significant has been overlooked. But as more details began to surface, coincidence became harder to maintain. There were patterns, subtle, incomplete, but present, similarities that could not be easily dismissed, timelines that, while not perfectly aligned, suggested a kind of rhythm. And most importantly, there was a growing sense that these fragments were not isolated, that they were part of something larger. This is the moment where an investigation begins to take form, not as a fully structured process, but as a shift in perspective, that a willingness to consider that what has been seen so far is only part of the story. For Armstrong, this shift represented the first real challenge to the invisibility he had maintained for so long. Because invisibility does not disappear all at once, it fades, gradually, as awareness increases, as connections formed, as questions become more focused, at this stage. Those questions were still developing. There was no clear direction why did, no definitive understanding of what was being uncovered. But there was enough to continue looking, and that decision, to continue looking, is what separates unnoticed patterns from recognized ones. Because recognition requires persistence, it requires the willingness to follow details even when they do not immediately make sense, to hold on to uncertainty long enough for clarity to emerge. And that is not always easy to. In many cases, investigations stall at this point. The lack of concrete evidence, the complexity of the information, the absence of clear connections, all of these factors can make it difficult to move forward. And for a time, it seemed as though that might happen here as well. The scattered nature of the information made it difficult to build a cohesive picture. The lack of a central point of reference created uncertainty. And without that clarity, the process risked losing momentum. This is why the title of this chapter carries such weight, because there is a very real possibility that this story could have remained hidden, that the fragments could have remained separate, that the pattern, despite existing, might never have been fully recognized. But something prevented that. Something kept the questions alive. Perhaps it was the persistence of certain details. Perhaps it was the intuition of those who refused to dismiss the inconsistencies. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulation of enough fragments that ignoring them was no longer possible. Whatever the reason, the investigation did not stop. That IT continued, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. And as it did, the fragments began to align more clearly. Connections that once seemed uncertain started to take shape. Timelines became more defined. Patterns became more visible. And with that visibility came a shift from uncertainty to recognition. This is the moment where everything changes, the point where what was once hidden begins to take form in a way that can no longer be ignored, where the illusion of normalcy starts to break, where the gap between appearance and reality begins to close. For Armstrong, this moment was not immediate. IT did not disrupt his outward life right away, but it marked the beginning of the end of his invisibility. Because once a pattern is recognized, even partially, it sets in motion a process that is difficult to reverse. Questions become more focused, attention becomes more directed, and the space in which something can remain hidden begins to shrink. At this stage, the investigation was still incomplete. There were still unknowns, still gaps in understanding, but the direction had changed. The fragments were no longer isolated. They were being viewed as part of a larger narrative. And that narrative, though not yet fully understood, was becoming clearer with each passing moment. There is something deeply significant about this transition, because it represents the shift from silence to awareness, from invisibility to recognition, from uncertainty to the beginning of truth. And once that shift occurs, everything that follows is shaped by it. By the end of this chapter, the investigation is no longer just a possibility. It is a reality, still developing, still incomplete, but undeniably present. The questions have been asked, the connections have begun to form, and the process of uncovering what has been hidden is now in motion. What comes next will not happen quietly, because once the truth begins to surface, it does not remain hidden for long. Chapter 11: Confession, Reality, and the Weight of Truth. There is a moment in every hidden story when silence gives way to something else, not gradually, not quietly, but with a weight that cannot be ignored. For years, everything had existed beneath the surface, patterns unrecognized, fragments unconnected, a life lived in two realities that never fully collided. The outward image remained intact, the internal world remained concealed, and the distance between the two allowed everything to continue. But once an investigation begins to take shape, that distance starts to close. And when it closes far enough, something inevitable happens. The truth begins to surface, not all at once, not in perfect clarity, but in pieces that, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. For John Eric Armstrong, this stage marked the point where the carefully maintained separation between appearance and reality began to break down. The questions that had once existed in uncertainty were now more focused. The fragments that had once been scattered were now being examined together, and the narrative that had remained hidden for so long was beginning to form. This is a moment defined not by action, but by realization. The realization that something far more complex and far more serious has been unfolding beneath what once seemed ordinary. For those involved in uncovering the truth, this stage carries a particular kind of weight, because it requires confronting the possibility that what has been discovered is only part of a much larger reality, that the visible details are just the surface, and that beneath them lies something deeper, something that challenges previous assumptions, something that forces a reevaluation of everything that came before. As the investigation progressed, the focus began to narrow. Patterns that had once been uncertain became more defined. Connections that had once seemed coincidental began to appear intentional. and slowly, the scope of what was being uncovered started to take shape. The center of that emerging picture was Armstrong, the same individual who had, for years, existed without drawing attention, the same individual who had maintained a consistent outward identity, the same individual who had blended into every environment he entered. Now, that identity was being examined more closely, not as an isolated presence, but as part of a larger pattern. And with that examination came a shift in perception. The ordinary began to look different. Details that once seemed insignificant took on new meaning. Behaviors that had been overlooked were reconsidered in light of new information. This is one of the most profound aspects of uncovering hidden patterns, the way it transforms understanding, the way it reshapes memory, the way it forces a reconsideration of what was once accepted as normal. For Armstrong, this shift did not immediately alter his outward behavior. He continued to exist within the same framework he always had. The mask remained. The routine continued. But outside of that routine, the environment around him was changing. The space in which he had remained unseen was becoming smaller. The gap between perception and reality was narrowing. And with each step of the investigation, the possibility of exposure grew stronger. There is also an important psychological dimension to this stage, the moment when an individual becomes aware or begins to sense that the separation they have maintained may no longer hold, that the internal and external worlds may soon collide. This awareness, when it occurs, can create its own kind of tension. A recognition that something has shifted, that the conditions which once allowed invisibility are no longer entirely present. For Armstrong, this moment was approaching. Whether fully recognized or not, the environment around him was no longer the same. The questions were no longer abstract. The investigation was no longer uncertain, and the pattern that had once remained hidden was now being actively examined. This is the beginning of confrontation. Not necessarily a direct or immediate one, but a process that leads toward it. A process where truth moves closer to the surface, where uncertainty gives way to clarity, and where the separation between what is known and what is hidden becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. There is a weight to this process, a gravity, that builds as more information is uncovered. Because each new detail does not exist in isolation. It connects, it reinforces, it expands the understanding of what has taken place. And with that expansion comes a deeper realization that the story is not what it once seemed, that the ordinary was never truly ordinary, that something significant had been unfolding in plain sight. By the end of this part, the truth has not yet been fully revealed, but it is close, closer than it has ever been. Investigation has moved beyond possibility into certainty. The focus has narrowed, the connections have formed, and the space for concealment has diminished. All that remains is the moment where everything that has been hidden is brought into the open. There comes a moment in every hidden story when the distance between silence and truth disappears entirely, not gradually, not quietly, but with a kind of finality that reshapes everything that came before it. For John Eric Armstrong, that moment arrived not as a sudden collapse of everything he had built, but as a gradual convergence of pressure, awareness, and inevitability. The investigation that had once been uncertain had now taken form. The fragments had aligned. The questions had narrowed. And at the center of it all was him. What makes this stage so complex is not just the emergence of truth, but the way that truth unfolds. It does not always arrive in a single, clear statement. It can come in layers, in admissions, in pieces that must be understood within a broader context. Because once the process of uncovering begins, it rarely stops at the surface. It goes deeper and deeper, until the full weight of what has been hidden begins to take shape. For those involved in the investigation, this stage represents a shift from searching to confirming. The uncertainty that once defined the early stages is replaced by a growing clarity. Patterns are no longer theoretical. They are supported by evidence, by connections that now hold under scrutiny. And with that clarity comes confrontation. Not necessarily in a dramatic or confrontational sense, but in the unavoidable meeting between what has been discovered and the person at the center of it. This is where the concept of confession enters the story, not as a simple admission, but as a moment where the internal and external realities finally intersect. For years, Armstrong had maintained a separation between these two worlds. His outward identity remained intact, consistent, believable. His internal world evolved separately, hidden from those around him. But now, that separation could no longer be sustained. Because the external world had caught up, the investigation had reached a point where the hidden could no longer remain entirely concealed. And in that space, something shifts. Confession, in cases like this, is not always straightforward. It is not always immediate. It can be partial, measured, revealed in stages. But regardless of how it unfolds, it represents a turning point. Because once something is acknowledged, even in part, it changes the entire structure of the narrative. What was once hidden becomes part of the known. What was once uncertain becomes part of the record. And what was once internal becomes external. For Armstrong, this process marked the end of the invisibility he had maintained for so long. The mask that had defined his outward life was no longer sufficient to contain what had been uncovered. The routine that had once provided stability could no longer shield him from the reality that was now emerging, and the duality that had allowed him to exist in two separate worlds had collapsed into one. There is a profound weight in this moment, not just in the facts themselves, but in the realization of what they represent. Years of hidden patterns, unseen connections, moments that, when viewed individually, seemed isolated, but when brought together, formed something far more significant for those who had interacted with Armstrong in his outward life. This realization would have been particularly difficult. The understanding that someone who appeared so ordinary could be connected to something so complex and deeply concealed. It challenges perception. It forces a reevaluation of what it means to truly know another person, and it highlights a difficult truth: that outward behavior does not always reflect internal reality. As the confession and evidence came together, the full scope of the situation began to emerge, not all at once, but steadily, each new detail adding to the overall understanding, each connection reinforcing what had already been discovered. And with each step, the narrative became clearer, more defined, more undeniable. This is the stage where ambiguity fades, where the questions that once dominated the investigation begin to be replaced by answers, not necessarily comforting answers, but answers nonetheless. And with those answers comes a shift, from uncertainty to acknowledgement, from speculation to reality. For Armstrong, this meant that the life he had maintained, the carefully constructed image of normalcy, was no longer the defining narrative. It had been replaced by truth, by evidence, by a reality that could no longer be separated from his identity. There is no return from this point. Once the truth has surfaced, it cannot be undone. It becomes part of the story, part of the record, part of the understanding of everything that came before. By the end of this chapter, the hidden has been revealed, the pattern has been recognized, the separation between appearance and reality has collapsed, and the story has moved from silence into clarity. What remains now is not the question of what happened, but the meaning of it, the impact, the lessons, and the understanding of how something so significant could remain hidden for so long. Chapter 12, legacy of silence. Lessons from the unseen killer. When a story like this reaches its end, there is often an expectation of closure, that a sense that once the truth has been uncovered, everything settles into place. That the questions fade, the narrative becomes complete, and understanding replaces uncertainty. But the reality is more complex, because stories that unfold in silence, stories that remain hidden for years, shaped by patterns that no one initially sees, do not end cleanly. They leave behind echoes, questions that linger, reflections that extend far beyond the events themselves. For John Eric Armstrong, the conclusion of his story does not exist solely in the facts that were uncovered or the outcomes that followed. It exists in the space between what was visible and what was missed, because that space holds the most important lessons. And those lessons are not always easy to confront. One of the most significant realizations is how effectively someone can exist within the boundaries of normalcy while living a completely separate internal reality. Armstrong was not hidden in the traditional sense. He was not isolated from society or removed from everyday life. That he was present, visible, part of the environments he moved through. And yet, he remained unseen in the ways that mattered most. This challenges a common assumption: that danger is always obvious, that it reveals itself through clear and unmistakable signs. In many cases, it does not. It exists quietly, within routine, within familiarity, within the very spaces that feel the most ordinary. Armstrong's ability to maintain this level of invisibility was not based on extraordinary deception alone. It was reinforced by expectation. People saw what they expected to see. They interpreted his behavior through the lens of normalcy. And because that lens remained intact, anything that did not fit within it was either overlooked or explained away. This is not a failure of individuals. It is a reflection of how human perception works. We rely on patterns, on consistency, on the assumption that what we observe aligns with reality. And in most cases, that assumption holds true. But in rare and complex situations, it does not. And when it does not, the gap between perception and reality can become significant. Another important aspect of this story is the role of invisibility, not just in how Armstrong existed, but in how others were seen. The individuals whose lives intersected with his were often not part of systems that ensured consistent visibility. They moved through spaces where connection was limited, where absence was not immediately recognized, where their stories did not always reach the level of attention they deserved. This is a difficult but essential truth: that visibility is not evenly distributed, that some lives are more easily overlooked, and that this imbalance can contribute to how long patterns remain hidden. Understanding this does not change what happened, but it does provide context. It highlights the importance of awareness, of connection, of ensuring that individuals are not lost within the margins of society. Because when people are seen, truly seen, it becomes much harder for patterns to remain unnoticed. There is also a deeper psychological lesson within this story: the way internal worlds can develop independently of outward behavior, the way patterns can form gradually, reinforced over time, without interruption, and the way those patterns, once established, can become integrated into a person's identity. This does not mean that such outcomes are inevitable. Far from it. Human behavior is complex, influenced by countless variables, and shaped by both internal and external factors. But it does mean that understanding those patterns, recognizing how they form, how they evolve, and how they can be interrupted, is essential, because interruption is key. At multiple points in this story, the absence of interruption allowed patterns to continue. The lack of recognition, the fragmentation of information, the environments that enabled anonymity. All of these factors contributed to the duration of what remained hidden, and that raises an important question. What might have been different if those patterns had been recognized earlier? It is not a question that can be answered with certainty, but it is a question that matters, because it speaks to the broader theme of awareness out of how small details, when considered together, can form something significant out of how questions, even when uncertain, can lead to understanding, and of how attention, careful, thoughtful attention, can make a difference. Be why the time the truth emerged, it did so with clarity. The fragments had been connected, the pattern had been revealed, and the narrative that had remained hidden for so long was finally understood. But understanding does not erase what came before it. It does not remove the time during which everything remained unseen. And it does not eliminate the lessons that arise from that silence. Those lessons remain, not as conclusions, but as reflections, as reminders of how complex human behavior can be, of how perception can both reveal and conceal, and of how important it is to look beyond the surface, even when everything appears ordinary, because sometimes it is within the ordinary that the most complex stories are hidden. When everything has been revealed, when the fragments have been assembled, the pattern understood, and the truth brought into the open, what remains is not just a story, but an imprint, a quiet imprint that lingers long after the events themselves have passed. Because stories like this do not simply end. They echoed in the way we think, in the way we observed, in the way we understand the space between what is visible and what is hidden. For John Eric Armstrong, the end of his story is not defined solely by the moment his actions were uncovered. It is defined by the realization that followed, the collective understanding that something had existed for years without being fully seen. And that realization carries weight, not just because of what happened, but because of how it remained concealed. There is a tendency, when looking back at events like these, to search for a clear point of origin, a moment where everything could have been recognized, where intervention could have occurred, where the trajectory might have changed. But the truth is rarely that simple. There is no single moment in a clear dividing line. Instead, there is a series of small, subtle developments, each one building on the last, each one contributing to a larger pattern that only becomes visible in hindsight. And that is what makes reflection so important, because it allows us to examine those developments, not to assign blame, but to understand how they unfolded, to recognize the conditions that allowed them to continue, and to consider how awareness might alter similar situations in the future. One of the most enduring lessons from this story is the idea that normalcy can be deeply misleading, that what appears calm, predictable, and ordinary on the surface does not always reflect the full reality beneath it. This does not mean that normalcy should be viewed with suspicion, but it does mean that it should not be accepted without thought. That observation should go beyond the surface. That understanding should be rooted not only in what is seen, but in how things connect over time. There is also a broader societal reflection that emerges from this narrative. The importance of visibility, that of ensuring that individuals are not lost within the margins, that absence is noticed, that stories are connected. Because when people are seen, when their presence is recognized and valued, it becomes much more difficult for patterns to remain hidden. This is not just about systems or structures. The IT is about awareness, about attention, about the willingness to look beyond what is immediately apparent. To Armstrong's ability to exist undetected for so long was not just a reflection of his own behavior. It was also shaped by the environments he moved through. Environments where continuity was limited, where connections were fragmented, where information did not always flow in a way that allowed patterns to be recognized. Understanding this does not change the outcome, but it provides context that IT highlights the importance of connection between people, between information, between moments that might otherwise remain separate, because it is in those connections that patterns become visible. And once they are visible, they can be understood. And once they are understood, they can be addressed. There is also a deeply human element to this story that cannot be overlooked, the realization that people are more complex than they appear, that identity is not always singular or transparent, that someone can exist in a way that feels entirely familiar, while carrying something unseen beneath the surface. This is not a reason for fear, but it is a reason for awareness, for thoughtful observation, for the understanding that perception, while powerful, is not always complete. As this story comes to a close, what remains is not just a sequence of events, but a series of reflections on perception, on invisibility, on the quiet ways in which patterns can develop over time, and on the importance of recognizing those patterns before they reach a point where they can no longer be ignored. Because recognition is the turning point, the moment where something hidden becomes known, where silence gives way to understanding, where the unseen becomes visible. For years, John Eric Armstrong existed within that silence, moving through life without drawing attention, maintaining an image that aligned with expectations, operating within a space where perception and reality remained separate. But in the end, that separation could not hold. The truth emerged, the pattern was revealed, and the silence that had defined so much of the story was replaced by clarity. Not perfect clarity, not complete understanding, but enough to bring the story into the open. And once it was there, it could no longer be unseen. That is the lasting impact of this narrative, not just in what it reveals about one individual, but in what it reveals about how easily something can remain hidden when it aligns with what we expect to see, and how important it is to look beyond that expectation. To question, to connect, to remain aware. Because sometimes the most complex truths are not hidden in darkness, but in plain sight.